I say this to get started, and that is, you probably noticed, maybe not, but anyway, the title of the book is Intergenerational Youth Ministry, but it's really not a youth ministry book. And that is, what I want to say is that youth ministry is important. Donnie and I were talking, even with the Vision for Youth board this morning, and I will tell you something. I travel, God lets me do that, BBC lets me do that, I'm very, very thankful. And I'm in a lot of churches every year. A lot of different size churches, a lot of different kinds of churches. And I will tell you something that I've noticed recently, and Tim and I were freshmen together at BBC, and so we've been around a long time. But I'm telling you, it seems as if youth ministry in a lot of places is de-emphasized more than it's been the last couple of decades. And frankly, that bothers me. That's a burden of mine. One of the things that you'll notice today even is that I am not, I'm thankful for Kara Powell and David Kinnaman from Barna Research and others who have talked about my book. I'm very, very thankful. I really am. But more than anything else, I'm just an observer. I'm going to tell you what I see. And not that I'm some great practitioner, I've got this all nailed. I just want to talk with you about trends and the things that I see, and that's what we're going to do in these sessions together. And so what I want to talk with you, even as we get started, are some observations. And so even though I called the book Intergenerational Youth Ministry, and then the subtitle is Why a Balanced View of Connecting the Generations is Essential for the Church, there are some out there who are saying youth ministry is wrong, it's failed, do away with youth ministry, do away with all age group ministries. That is not where I am. I can argue all day for the strengths of youth ministry. Tomorrow we will do that together a little bit, and I will talk with you about that. And so I want to emphasize youth ministry, not de-emphasize it, which is why I called the book that. However, on the banners and all of that, I am talking about intergenerational ministry, because I believe it's essential, and it's something that we got to talk about, and I think it's incredibly relevant, incredibly timely. A lot of people around the country, internationally too, are talking about this topic, and so let's dig in and do that together. At the end of our sessions, every single time, I think, right, Tim, during these workshops, we're going to carve out time for Q&A and interaction. On your chair when you came in, there should be a half sheet of paper with blue and green ink that has some discussion questions. And so if you don't ask me those questions, or I'm going to ask you those questions, all right? So that's what we're going to do at the end of the session today. Before we dig in, we're going to go rapid fire, and then we'll stop, we'll slow down, we'll take some time for some interaction for Q&A. But let me pray, can I? And we'll ask God's blessing on our sessions together. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. I thank you for your word. I thank you for your church. And I thank you for your people. And God, I just pray that we would honor you with everything that we do, everything that we say, our thought process. And God, I just pray that you bless our time together. Help us to be about you, about your work, and not any more, not any different than that, Father, for your glory, for your name's sake, Christ's name. In his name we pray. Amen. I'm an observer, and I want to start here by asking a couple of questions. And I'm not the only one saying this, but I just want to ask, and that is youth ministry in crisis? There are people out there who are saying that youth ministry needs to be totally chucked and reevaluated, if nothing else. One of those, Mark Ostreicher, used to be with Youth Specialties, wrote this book, Youth Ministry 3.0. Another one just came out of Pew, P-E-W, research, The Rise of the Nones, N-O-N-E-S, which is the fastest growing religious affiliation in this country is none. Okay, why have so many kids been a product of evangelical churches, youth ministries, and then when they get to be adults, decide not to be involved in evangelical churches? Why? That's happening. I think we have to talk about that. And then also, some of you are familiar with Vodi Bakum and the Divided the movie and all of that. I do not land there. You can read about that in the book, and I have heard him speak. You can look up Divided the movie. When I first started the book, there was a guy I was writing, and I have a little blog that I write, and there was a pastor not too far away from us in Clark Summit where I live who wrote me a letter just ripping what I wrote on my blog about youth ministry. And he's telling me that youth ministry is Darwinism and that it's a failure, and it proves that it's a failure and all of that because the kids are walking away, and that seriously, that I'm a hypocrite for teaching that about that, and I'm the problem with the church. And so I went to see him and had a talk, and he was a family integrated guy, and to do away with all age groups and those kinds of things. And that's what that group is teaching. I just want you to know from the get-go, that's not where I land. I believe in peer ministry with all my heart, but I believe in balance. And I also think that if all we do is segregate teenagers to the basement, you know, we keep kids in the basement until they graduate from high school, and then we tell them to go to big church, they're probably going to walk away. They're probably going to hate big church. They don't know anybody. I'm going to talk with you about why, what I found in my research, and that's where we're going to get started today. But I do want to ask you some questions. Beginning of December, I went to a seminar by David Kinnaman. David Kinnaman is the new president. He's a new owner at Barna Research. If you could see him, I just got my phone. I was sitting in the front row, and I took a picture, and he's one of those guys that he and I had never met each other until that seminar, but through the magic of Twitter, we had connected, and he actually has been talking about my book a little bit on his seminar. But he said that day, so this is December, like a month ago, David Kinnaman, the president of Barna, says the way we think about youth ministry has to change. And that's what people around the country are saying. So I just want to ask you a question, and I'm hoping that from the top of your lungs, you will say a resounding no. But is youth ministry failing the church? And again, what I'm telling you is that I'm an observer. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. None of that. I'm just an observer. But I want to just tell you some basic concerns. And some of this, if you were here last year, I covered some of this in the initial session last year, but not this. This is something that is brand new in my thinking. And I just want to tell you that as I have traveled around even this year, it's interesting that, and there's not space in your notes for this necessarily. You can jot it down on the pad of paper or off to the side or whatever. But I want to tell you some recent trends that I've noticed. And I put 3 things on the PowerPoint on the slide that are talking about some of the things that I've noticed recently in local church youth ministry. And frankly, I'm concerned about all 3 of those things. In my book, I hope I do. I hope you read it. I know that I gave a copy to my wife when the book came out. She read it, so I got one that did read it. But in the book, I talk a little bit about the history of youth ministry. And I do that not to bore you, and I'm not this grand historian or whatever, but I'll tell you something about youth ministry that I learned from reading guys like Mark Center and others who have written a lot about the history of youth ministry. That youth ministry started with visionary leaders, right? Who were basically youth ministry happened in the, and I write about this in the book, happened to become in vogue basically right after the time in America, after World War II. The GIs were coming home. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about that in the next session tomorrow morning. But there was this growing youth culture that happened, almost like a perfect storm. And again, we'll talk a little bit about this morning, but I remember reading the stories. How many of you have ever been to Word of Life in Schroon Lake, New York? Anybody ever been up there? Like if you go into Jack Wurtzen Center in Word of Life, they have all these pictures, which were Yankee Stadium in the 1940s. Jack Wurtzen and Percy Crawford. Percy Crawford he was the first guy in America that ran a Christian radio called Young People's Church of the Air. And they started what became the Youth Rally in the 40s. They rented Yankee Stadium. Look magazine had an article in the 40s about how 10,000 people were turned away from a youth rally. And Percy Crawford, who was a musician, Jack Wurtson, the founder of Word of Life, said, here's how you reach young people. You have a good speaker and lively music. And basically, we've been doing that ever since in youth ministry, but that's how it got started. But there's some things recently, I think, that even though visionary leaders, youth ministry is designed, I think, right? I think this is it, to reach people within culture. Is that right? And so I think of anybody I know, seriously, of anybody that I've known over all my years in ministry, I think youth workers are most concerned about being culturally relevant. And I say amen to that. But I think, and this is what I want to talk with you about as we get started, I think there may be a problem brewing. And so I am not a critic, I'm an observer. But let me talk to you about three of them to begin with. Number one is I've noticed recently that we have become way too program driven. Remember I said probably if there's a death word to youth workers, it's program. Like what we need is one more box of stuff, right? That somebody from Chicago or somewhere is going to send us a program, and all we have to do is unpack the box, and we have, that's death to us. And I think we're all about, anybody who's read any youth ministry books for the last probably 30 years has written about relational youth ministry. Praise God. That's us. But I think, I'm not a critic. I think there may be a problem brewing, and here it is. We'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow night, and that is that my program is most important. A lot of youth workers that I know are getting very frustrated by high school athletes and busy kids that are so busy on Wednesday night to come to youth group or busy on Sunday afternoons. And I think, folks, we need to rethink that. If any of you are readers, Youth Worker Journal, this is the brand new Youth Worker Journal. Doug Fields, who has spoke here at our conference before, is on the front. I made sure to bust him on that picture. And he writes on there, and that is basically this, and that is, are we more worried about millennial spiritual health or about the health of our institutions? Are we most worried about if a kid comes to our youth group than we are about that same kid growing and going on for God? That's number one. I'm not here to give you necessarily all kinds of programming ideas or box things for you to think through, but I want you to think that one through. And I think, honestly, the answer to that is building relationships, and do we want our kids going on for God over the long haul? And I think that's the key. And I think as you, I'm 60 years old, and I think as you go through your youth ministry, that's a big one that you're going to have to think about. And that is, I think with busy schedules, tomorrow we're gonna talk a little bit more about this. And I was kidding Tim today. I'm going to give you a copy of an article tomorrow that Tim Algram wrote, which I think is the best thing that he ever wrote. And that is, well, I mean, most of his things are good because I edit them. But he wrote an article. By the way, if you want copies, this is okay with Tim. On the website, Intergenerational Youth Ministry, if you go to downloads, his article is there. I want busy kids in my youth ministry. Notice he didn't say coming to my youth group meeting. And that's something that you're going to have to think. And that is, even world changers, kids that are involved in a lot of different programs, are they going to come to your thing? Or are they going to be involved in sports or whatever? I think that's something that we're going to have to think through as we go on. And that's a cultural thing that you're going to have to think through. I think another one is, let me back up, another one is what I call student-oriented programming. And I think, in fact, God has really been putting a burden on my heart the last few months is, Lord willing, and based upon resources and research and all those kinds of things, I'm gonna try to do as quickly as I can a follow-up book, which will probably be, I think this is the first time in public that I've announced this, which is probably going to be intergenerational family ministry. And I think that's the thing, the Vodi Bakum thing and all of that, I think one of the things that you're going to have to come to grips with is what are you going to do about parents? I think here's the trend. For the last 2 years, I've been the vice president of enrollment at Baptist Bible College. And I'm thank the Lord, I am now out of enrollment. But I've noticed two things. I've noticed helicopter parents. You ever hear that term, right? A lot of researchers are talking about stealth bomber parents. I've read the statistic from Verizon phone said that an average college freshman texts or emails or phone his parents 11 times a day. Are you kidding me? The day I met Tim Alger, my freshman year at BBC, my dad, I lived 35 miles away. My dad drove me down to BBC, and I'm dead serious. In the back of my dorm, my dad said, "Get out of the car." He didn't go to any meetings. He didn't help me carry my stuff up. And then, he'd call them. They moved when I was in college and didn't tell me where they went. Helicopter parents, right? Helicopter parents. There's research that according to MTV, by the way, I'm sure that they are the bastion of educational research. But MTV says that about 70%, MTV says that about 70% of today's millennials say their parents are their best friends. But I think my observation the last couple of years, even BBC, is an incredible dichotomy, and that is, Tim and I have talked about this a lot too, and that is you're going to have to balance, youth workers, helicopter parents that are overly involved. Donnie, can I tell them the New York City story? We had a parent in New York City, New York, New Hope for New York missions trip, because not us, but their youth pastor said their kids couldn't have a cell phone in New York City. The dad was going to file kidnapping charges against the youth pastor and against Vision for Youth because we took their cell phone away. We didn't. In fact, we didn't even think it was a good idea, but the youth pastor made up a rule. Helicopter parents, stealth bomber parents, and that is, are you taking care of the safety? The dichotomy is uninterested parents. I hope you know this, and that is, youth workers, what are you going to do? Because you're going to have tons of these too that don't care, those parents. Believe me, that's going to be your debate in family ministry. You do this divided thing, this family integrated thing. What are you going to do about the family that doesn't care? I noticed that at BBC. The dichotomy is unbelievable to me. How parents do everything, fill out every jot and tittle of their kids' financial aid thing, and then you got parents that don't even look at the thing. Disinterested parents, and that's going to be the dilemma of your ministry. And you talk about culture and reaching out to your culture. Believe me, those are two things that you're going to have to deal with, and that is, are you dealing with students, or are you dealing with families and parents, or is it both somehow? Tomorrow night, we're going to talk about that at length, and in fact, we're going to end our time tomorrow night where I'm going to talk with you because, honest to goodness, I want your input on something, and that is, what do you guys do? Do you ever adopt kids from dysfunctional families, and how does that work in your church? I want you to talk with me about that tomorrow, because if we're going to do family ministries, what do you do for the kids from parents who don't care? Or if you're reaching kids for Christ and they're not from a Christian family, what do you do about those? The world has Big Brother, right? The world has mentoring. The world has adopt families and mentoring thing. Well, how are we doing in the church like that? And we'll talk about that tomorrow night. And then another one, I think, is what I call, I'm not sure what to call this, but another one is teen only. And this is going to be the springboard into our basic premise this afternoon. And that is what I call as a teen only emphasis. And here's my point about that. And that is, I have honestly talked to youth workers this year who have told me, because our burden in our church, we work with the college-age people in our church. And I've been at BBC, and so that's a big burden to mine. My son has done college ministry at Eastern Michigan and those kinds of things. And so, and then the number one time that people leave church and walk away from God is right after they graduate from high school. So what are we doing about young adults? This year, I can't tell you the number of youth pastors who have basically said to me, Mel, that's not my problem. When they leave youth group, I'm done. I'm the guy at Baptist Bible College that for 2 years read the applications. I'm not kidding you. In most cases, you would, not always, praise God, and I know who I'm looking at because some of them are in this room, the exceptions. But in some cases, you would think the youth pastor or the pastor doesn't even know this kid that they're filling out the reference for. George Barna research. George Barna said the typical youth pastor, and the typical, I forget the numbers, and senior pastor never talk to their kids about where to go to college. It's almost like I'm done with you when you're done with youth group, and I'm not concerned about whether or not they stay in church even after youth group or whatever. My goodness. I think the teen-only emphasis is this. Whose kid are they? And are we really concerned? And I know I'm coming out blasting you in the beginning. I know I am, intentionally. And that is, are we concerned that our kids grow up and go on for God? And are we working with parents to see that happen? And how do we do that in the church? And so those are the things I want to talk with you about. And so is the church, is youth ministry failing, or is the church failing? And I think that's where we're going to start with the research and so on. And that is the two big trends, the two big trends that I think we need to talk about and that really started my journey on this book is this. The number one time, and this is where I talked a little bit about this last year in this conference. The number one time that people walk away from God and leave church is right after they graduate from high school. I heard George Barna talk about that at the turn of the millennium, 1999, 2000. And ever since then, I'm going to show you some of the research. My book has that. You've read a lot of it. And that's true, by the way, in a lot of different denominations. It's not just necessarily even evangelicals. There's a lot of research. I just went to the Barna seminar with David Kinnaman. His book, You Lost Me. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then the other trend that's in the news is the growing number of nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And that's the large number of people as adults, the fastest growing religious segment in the United States right now is those people who say, I don't want anything to do with organized religion, even though I grew up in a youth group, denominational youth group or whatever, that's not me. And I think they're looking at our generations and seeing, frankly, hypocrisy and seeing a life that they don't want and are saying, if that's what the church is like, I don't want to be a part of it, and are walking away. And we'll talk about that from my research in just a second. And so you've read this. I know you have. This was Lifeway research a few years ago. Young adults leaving the church. Here's what they're saying about that. And then the other one is, this is from Focus on the Family. The growing number of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, no religious affiliation. This basically is, my lifetime. I graduated from college in the mid-'70s. And look at that upward trend of people since that time. Now, a lot of people are saying, I get that. And that is, we're going to let them walk away. They'll come back, like Bill Hybels said with baby boomers. They'll come back and raise their kids in church. Are we willing to put up with that? Are we willing to say the kids that we've invested, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, then they walk away. Are we okay with that? And that's what I want to talk with you about in this session as we get started. Two books, I think, if you are into research at all. The first one on the left there, it's called Next America by Paul Taylor. That is filled with research, again, from Pew, P-E-W, research. And then the other book is called The Post-Church Christian. That book is written by Paul Nyquist, who's the president at Moody Bible Institute, and his son, Carson Nyquist. Carson is a millennial. Paul is a baby boomer, and they write the book from two different perspectives. I don't know about you. I read the book, and part of it drove me nuts, probably because I'm a baby boomer and not a millennial, but it talks with you about why are so many young adults walking away from church, and why are they fed up with church. It's kind of like that old Dan Kimball book, They Like Jesus, but not the church. And we'll talk about, and that's, that Dan Kimball book that's been out for a while. So This is what we're going to do in my sessions together, and then we're going to dig in, and I'm going to go rapid fire and then get you involved a little bit. We're going to talk about why they're leaving. Tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about how did this happen program-wise, and a little bit about what we can do about that, what to do now. Again, I believe that youth ministry started by visionary leaders that saw something in culture and said, I'm going to do this to reach this culture for Christ. And so let's talk about that a little bit and what we can do about it. Tomorrow night, probably my growing burden right now at this stage of my life is what we're going to do tomorrow night together, and that is talk about it takes a church when the parents, Christian parents and the church collaborate, and how do we do that together. And yeah, that's a real burden of mine. And then on Wednesday morning before we go, we'll talk about building an intergenerational church and what to do even if you're not a decision maker back home. In other words, even if your senior pastor's not here, okay? Or even if the elders aren't here or the deacons aren't here. What can you do if you're just a person who cares? That's how we're going to end this on Wednesday morning. And so make sure you stay. That's the best session of the conference. I'm just kidding. Anyway, let's do this rapid fire. Our kids are leaving the church. Some of this we gave you last year. But our kids are leaving the church. I know you know this. The number one time that people walk away from their relationship with God and their relationship with the church is right after they graduate from high school. This has been going on for a while. Let me show you what some of the people are saying about it. Years ago, George Barna, this report, by the way, if you're interested in this stuff, barna.org. There's a lot of stuff there for free, including this article, which is most 20-somethings put Christianity on the shelf. Okay? And again, the PDFs of all of these slides are on that website, intergenerationalyouthministry.com. He says 61% had been churched at one point during their teenage years, but are now spiritually disengaged. That term, spiritually disengaged, kind of became a buzzword about this problem. Number two, this is that Lifeway research I talked with you about a little while ago. This made USA Today. Young adults aren't sticking with the church. Notice the subhead. It says 70% of surveyed Protestants, 70% stopped attending by age 23. That article writes about this. These were kids that once were in your youth group, but when they became young adults, they quit going to church. People, let me stop. Is that happening to you? I'm not asking for response now, but I do think you ought to know. What about those kids? In one of the chapters in the book, I write about how it's the first Sunday of the new year, and all the kids who graduated from high school are gone. Kind of a, made-up scenario, and that is, we don't know where they are in Sunday school, but they can't come. In America, we don't let college kids come to youth group. We kick them out of youth group, and so where do they go? We don't know. And that's just okay because we got the next year's class to worry about. Young adults aren't sticking with the church. Here's another one. You lost me, David Kinnaman. I told you about him. I went to hear him about a month ago. He writes this: millions of young adults leave active involvement in the church after they exit their teenage years. Here's another one. Tom Rainier, who's the president of Lifeway, he and his son wrote this book together, Essential Church. Anybody read this book? A lot of you have seen it. It's been out like 10 years now, I think, maybe 8 years. Most dropouts leave the church between the ages of 17 and 19. Many of you probably are aware of this, and I'm not here to point fingers at all or whatever, but a lot of the youth workers I talked to talked about the dropout after high school. Frankly, a lot of youth workers say that starts to happen before they leave high school. I don't know if that's been your experience. Kids who were active as 9th, 10th graders are less and less active. Remember I told you about Tim's article? I think that's one issue that today's youth worker that you guys are going to have to wrestle with. I really do. And then this one. This is Kara Powell and Chap Clark in Sticky Faith. If you haven't read their books, by the way, this is kind of an interesting concept. Kara Powell and her team from Fuller released 2 books at the same time with the same name, but they're different. One is for parents, one is for youth workers, called Sticky Faith. They have a phenomenal website which has a lot of stories from around the country, which is worth going there as well. But Kara Powell says this, only 50%. And I don't know the difference between 50 or 61% or 70%. But they say only 50% of kids who graduate from church or youth groups will stick with their faith in college. And I don't know about you, but I think that's the kind of thing that ought to hit us right between the eyes as youth workers. And I wrote a chapter in this book that Mike Calhoun and I edited together, and Tim and a bunch of other people collaborated for this book, which I brought a few up for the conference, but I wrote a whole book to say this. I mean, look at the quote that's on the board with me for a minute. Only 50% of kids who graduate from church. Wait a minute. They graduate from church? My premise of this book is that can't happen. They don't graduate from church. You graduate from college, you graduate from high school, you graduate from kindergarten, you graduate, but you shouldn't graduate from church. But it seems like that's where we've become. That's where we've come. And that is, there's this ending point. We're done. We wipe our hands from, and so I hope that that's your burden, youth workers, is that we must care about them through college age and through adulthood, that what God's goal is for their life is that they grow up, Ephesians 4, and go on for God, right? That's what, not just when we're done with them. So are the statistics true? In David Kinnaman's book, You Lost Me, he writes this: the reality of the dropout problem is not about a huge exodus of young people from the Christian faith. In fact, it's about various ways that young people become disconnected in their spiritual journey. The conclusion from the research is that, and then the highlight is mine, if you can read the slide. It says most young people with a Christian background are dropping out of conventional church involvement. And then I quit the emphasis, not losing their faith. And so let me just switch slides in a minute to say, I'm going to put that up again. Most young people, this is brand new. There's that book I was telling you about before. They like Jesus but not the church. And then Nyquist's book. Most young people with a Christian background are dropping out of church involvement, not losing their faith. But here's the thing that I want to ask you. Is that okay with you? I hope that, again, in your heart, the answer is no. In other words, what a lot of people are writing about today is that these kids aren't walking away from the faith. They're walking away from church. Well, I think that the Bible teaches us that the church is the bride of Christ, the body of Christ, and they're together. And that God intended His work in our day to be a communal activity, the church. And I don't think we should be okay with that. That there's going to be this generation that walk away from church and that they're going to have some relationship with God, on an island, some woods somewhere, or whatever. No, I want them in church. But I think we need to think through church. And I think that's where intergenerational connections come in, and so on. So why are they leaving? In my book, I went to, like I said, almost 90 different churches and talked to tons of young adults and tons of youth pastors. And I have come to the conclusion, out of everything that I've read, this is me, Mel Walker, nobody else's. I'm telling you, I think these are the top 4 things. And these, I shared these last year, but a lot of you weren't here. And so let me just share these with you as we start in this thing today. Number 1 is, I think kids are likely to walk away if they're not grounded in biblical truth. They're likely to walk away if they're not grounded in biblical truth. Here's what's going to happen. And that is, they're going to go to college, whether it's at Cedarville or BBC or Ohio State or Maumee Bay Community College or whatever. Or they're going to go in the military, or they're going to work at a factory or whatever. And it's during college age. It's during college age where they're going to ask themselves, do I really believe this stuff? Up until then, their thought process, their background, largely their faith, not always, but largely their faith is developed, at least in somewhat, through their parents, right? Then they're college age and they get to pick. And when they pick, they choose to walk away. I think kids are likely to walk away if they're not grounded, if they don't know what they believe. I know that Ken Ham's book, Already Gone, and others have talked about that, and he tends to, criticize the Sunday school movement. We've taught them facts and not really biblical principles that apply, and I get that. I really do, and we can talk about that individually or collectively if you want to. But I think kids are likely to stick in the church if the doctrine, if the convictions are sound so that they know what they believe. When I first started this research, I was doing a seminar like this out a little bit farther in the Midwest, and I was talking about this, and there was one of my former students in the classroom when I got to this point in the workshop, and he said, Mel, I disagree. And I'm like, what? Disagree with me? Are you kidding me? So I hit him. But no, he said, that's not the problem. He said, my kids know the Scriptures, he said. My kids know the Scriptures. He said, they've just force-fed all the Scriptures. My kids know the Scriptures. He said, that's not the problem. It's the application of what they know. So I got the big Mel cheesy grin, and I said to this guy, a friend of mine, one of my students, do you mind if I test that while I'm here today? He said, what do you mean? And I said, honest, I was preaching in church that Sunday. I said, seriously, during church, go find 4 or 5 of your best kids, and before lunch, let's meet with them. Let me just ask them some questions. If I'm wrong, let me know. I'll quit saying this stuff. And so we did that, and I preached, and he got 4 or 5. We sat down in the Sunday school room. And so I started asking his kids questions, okay? How many books of the Bible they knew, how many books of the Old Testament they knew, how many books of the New Testament. I said, start with the patriarchs, start with like Abraham, go through they could do that. I even asked the kids like John 3:16, of course, and I even asked the kids the theme of Romans, and they knew some of that. But when I asked them, how do you know that the Bible is inspired? They struggled with those questions. How do you know that there's salvation by grace through faith how do you know that that's the only way to heaven? They struggled with that. So maybe he's right, maybe I'm right, but I think it nevertheless is that, and that is that they're likely, I don't care if they go to Cedarville or go to BBC or go to Iowa State or Ohio State or whatever, during college age is where they're going to be confronted. Do I really believe this? And they're likely to walk away unless it's real in their life. So how you doing with that? I'll tell you another trend, and that is I think that we have kind of gotten away. I know we're doing small groups and we're doing a lot of interactive stuff, but are we teaching our kids and working with parents to teach our kids the Scriptures? It's the Word of God that changes people's lives, right? It's the Word of God that changes people's lives. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but I was speaking at a camp a few years ago, and it was like an area-wide youth rally, and the guy gets up to introduce me like Tim did a little while ago, and he said, we're glad to have Mel here from BBC. Mel, Lord bless you as you speak, And I got up to speak, and I'm walking around telling about my family, and stuff like I did this afternoon. And I noticed the guy left. The guy that introduced me left. And in the back of this camp was a little doorway that went down a hallway, and down at the end of this room, there's probably 100 kids. Area-wide retreat, I was the speaker. And the kitchen was down there. So I walked around, and I looked around in the crowd, and all of the leaders were gone. It was me and 100 kids. And I'm like, I don't have any problem with that. But I wondered, where are they? And so I'm still talking to the kids. So I went over there, and I'm doing one of these numbers, and I realized that during my message, they were having some meeting. They were down there in the kitchen drinking coffee. So, I did a bad thing. And sometimes it's fun being big and having a big mouth. And that is, I took the next 3 or 4 minutes and worked the kids into a frenzy. I got them standing up. They had I think it's it's a camp distinctive. Right, they had those metal folding chairs. Every camp in America has that. And so I got the kids jumping on the chairs, pounding the chairs up and down, yelling, screaming, and all of that. And pretty soon the guy in charge is looking down the hallway like he's giving me the hairy eyeball, like Mel can't control 100 kids. And I'm like to the kids, keep it up, they'll come back. And pretty soon, I mean, it was chaos in the room. Screaming, yelling, banging the chairs. And pretty soon all the leaders come in and they stand in the back with their coffee. And they're all glaring at me like they're mad at me for something. And I said, the kids and I just took a survey. Survey? Well, we called it that. And I said to the leaders, I said, we think you guys need to hear this stuff too. And I said, I'll wait. And in the corner were some chairs, and they put their coffee down. They're all mad. They take their chairs and they're like, and they sit down. And I said, okay, we can start now. And that group has never invited me back. But please listen to me. Please listen to me. If we ever get to the place where we think God's word is no big deal, what are we teaching to our kids? If we act like, oh, this is old hat, I've heard that. If that's how we act, so don't be making sloppy joes in the kitchen during the message. Don't be doing, what are we showing to the, is it that important to us? Is this real in our lives? And so I think honestly, this is more practical than we think. Number two, kids are likely to walk away if there's no ownership in their local church. No ownership in their local church. I get it that this might be convicting, but here's how you can tell, and that is what happens with the teenagers on church business meeting night. If it's not their church, they don't care. They're going to leave. They're going to walk out. One of my pastors, Jason Jackson's here in the room, so I'm telling a heritage story, and he'll understand that. And there's some people who go to my church, but I was just on at our church a 3-year process to change the Constitution in our church. Jax, I will never do that ever again. Never. 3 years. But what we did, and I'm just telling you philosophically, is our church voted, number one, is we lowered the voting age in our Constitution. We lowered the voting age. And this is one of the reasons, and that is, do our teenagers have an ownership? Is it their church? Some of you have heard me tell this story too. I was a rookie youth pastor. My first year, we had this little gym in our church in Michigan where I served, just up the road, not too far away from here. We had this little gym, and we were playing this Mel Walker gym night thing. And I was only a youth pastor a couple months. Friday night, and the oldest guy in our church comes in the building, comes in the room, and walks right through the middle of the gym with his head down. And again, in the back of the room is a stairway that goes downstairs. The oldest guy in the church comes in, he walks right through, head down. I was proud of the kids because they didn't hit him in the head with a dodgeball. They didn't throw anything at him. They didn't, they respected him. The next thing you know, all the lights in the room went out. The circuit breakers were downstairs. He comes back up, head down, walks right through. So finally, I stop him. And I said, brother, what happened? Then he stopped, he looked up at me because he's ticked, and he said, I turned off the circuit breakers. And I said, why? And he said this, kids don't tithe, they don't deserve church electricity. Put his head down and walked out. Well, I'm not the brightest guy in the world, but I do know how to do circuits, and they gave me the key, and I got the circuits back on, click. But Mr. Cheney, Lord bless him, taught me a lesson, and that is, am I talking to my kids about tithing? Is it their church? And honestly, we did a thing from the rest of the time that I was a youth pastor. Every other year in our church, we did this thing, how my church works. And we would divide up members in our youth group, and they would go serve with different committees and different ministries in the church and come back to youth group. I mean, we would have teenagers, seriously, we'd have teenagers go to deacons meetings. Come to find out what the deacons talk about, it's not all that confidential. Come to find out, who knew? And let the teenage, do you realize this is what a deacon does, and so on. Is it their church? And I'll tell you, have they built up sweat equity? Like, do you let them vote? Do you tell them to give? Do you let them serve? Or here's another one, youth pastors. Do your kids have to go away on a mission trip before they can serve? Like, you'll let them serve somewhere else, but you can't serve in their church. One of the most impactful books I ever read was by Gary McIntosh, One Church, 4 Generations. And one of the things that he says is make sure the public ministries of the church, one church, 4 generations, make sure the public ministries of the church, like the worship team, like the ushers, like the greeters, are intergenerational. He says, or the visitors who come will think you're only a one generation church. So how you doing at that with the worship team in big church, with your ushers and your greeters and those kinds of thing? How you doing? Do they have sweat equity? I'm telling you, I am. I'm looking at you right in the eyeballs, people. It's a problem if your kids are more loyal to the youth group than they are to big church, because then they're going to walk away at some point, because their loyalty isn't to big church. Does that make sense? Number three, quickly. Number three, are they or they're not receiving consistent messages from influential adults? Are they or they're not receiving consistent messages from influential adults? And that is probably as big as anything on here. Are they receiving or they're not receiving influential or consistent messages? I'm thankful that Chris is here. I got PowerPoint. We had some snags with it. Of course, you live by technology and you die by technology, right? I love videos. I love PowerPoint. I love all that stuff. At my age, I got to admit to you, I'm still a fan of flannel graph. I can't understand how that stuff works. And you can make Peter in the boat. You can make Peter walking on the water. You can make him underneath it. That stuff's cool too. But the best visual aid, people listen to me. The best visual aid is not the greatest video. The best visual aid is not flannel graph. It's not cutesy pictures on a PowerPoint. The best visual aid is you. And what this generation needs more than anything else is to see in the life of godly adults, does this stuff work for you? Right? Does this stuff work for you? And is it genuine? Anybody who is writing about millennials, anybody is saying that what they want more than anything else is authenticity. Don't forget, this is a generation that's grown up with reality TV, right? Who's kidding who? Right? Survivor! Only the cameras are there already. My son Todd and I, we used to watch Man vs. Wild with Bear Grylls, the survival expert guy, right? They took it off the air for a while. Come to find out he was staying at the Hilton. Who knew? They took it off. Now it's back on. Now it says, Bear Grylls and his staff, stay at the Marriott or whatever. My whole family, last 2 years ago, were invited to a church in Anchorage, Alaska. We all the walkers, they support Christy. They flew Christy from Germany. Who knew you could fly up over the top? Who knew? And we all went to Alaska to talk at this church in Anchorage about the balance between family and ministry. Peggy didn't like it so much, but we had a blast in Alaska. And I talked to a guy who works on the North Shore, the oil wells, works where they film ice road truckers. And he told me it's made up. I was crushed. You know what we do? We have a generation, we do. We have some students here in the room, of contrived reality, made up. And let's not ever do that in church or youth group or camp. Let's not make up and then throw God into the mix somehow. Let's show them. And that's where intergenerational ministry is huge. They need to see the reality of Jesus Christ over the long haul. That is more powerful. That's why, today's teenagers, in the church, today's young people need old people. I think that's the genius behind an effective college ministry, by the way, is college kids need old people. Old people need younger people. And that's what the church is all about, right? And then there's one more. I think the fourth reason is, and this goes along, is they're not connected with other generations. They're likely to walk away. My friend, Chap Clark, who has been at our conference, he's been here before, has said that in order for a kid to stay, listen to this statistic, in order for a kid to stay in church, that he or she has to have strong relationships with 5 or 6 other adults other than their parents, or they'll never stay in church. And he even talks about above and beyond the youth leaders, because in their mind, they look at the youth leaders as part of the youth culture almost. So they need to have strong relationship with 5 or 6 other adults in order for them to stay and go to big church. because it is a matter of who you know. And we're going to spend the rest of our time together at this conference talking about that, developing intergenerational connections. I think today's young people have 4 key questions. What do I believe? Is this my church? Is Christianity real? Is it real in your life? And who do I know? Do I have lasting relationships with people from other generations in order for this to be my church? I'm almost done, but I think there's one other thing that I want, I'm going to kind of define my terms and then be done. And we'll have a break for supper until this evening's session. But I think in church, from mega churches to little tiny traditional churches in America, I think it has become traditional to establish a program that frankly isolates generations. And this is what I want to talk with you about before we're done today. Tradition, and every youth worker I know would say, you know, tradition is death. It's like that's the last thing we want. Really? A tradition is a long established way of thinking or acting. A continuing pattern of behavior, a customary or characteristic method, and then the handing down of customs from one generation to another generation. And so I think the trend is this in traditional churches. And you have in your notes little diagrams that have the silhouettes and all of that. But I think a lot of our churches, whether we think it's a good idea or not, have become generationally traditional. And again, we're going to be done with this session. I think a lot of our churches have what I call, I'm just going to define terms and be done. One generational ministry, and that is the children meet somewhere, the youth meet somewhere, and the adults meet somewhere, and then often the senior citizens meet somewhere else. One of the discussion questions on the sheet is that. Nod profusely if your church is like that. Even Titus 2, the classic older women are to teach younger women. We tend to violate that in the church. We take the old people and put them in a room with other old people. I mean, I admit, I like to hang out with people my own age. We have the same stories. You know, Tim tells me about the music because I don't have a clue, and I tell him basketball stories. Do you realize that Oscar Robertson was the best basketball player who ever lived? My generation, it is true. It's my reality. I think another idea of churches is I'm just defining my terms, multi-generational. I think multi-generational is like what we do in morning worship service. And that is the generations are all there, but they don't have anything to do with each other. That's what I call multi-generational. They're all there. And I'm telling you, classic morning worship service is like that. Every now and then our worship leader will say, take the next few minutes and go shake hands with somebody. And we did that today. You know, Tim gets up and says, you know, go meet somebody you don't know. You know, well, you look around. Look around. You know, the old people are talking to old people. The parents are talking to parents. The teenagers are talking to teenagers. We don't do a very good job in intergenerational ministry. We're going to spend the rest of our conference talking about how to do that. Okay? And then intergenerational, notice the connections, and by the magic of Microsoft PowerPoint, I threw in the chains, right? The connections. And that is the various age groups intentionally connect with each other and then retain peer identity. Notice the box. I am a big fan of youth ministry. In my book, there's chapters on how to do intergenerational youth children's ministry, how to do intergenerational youth ministry. We'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow and Wednesday morning. How to do intergenerational young adult ministry, senior citizens ministry. I honestly was going to do men's ministry and women's ministry, but the editor talked me out of it. Okay, they'll get the point. My point is everything we do needs to have the balance. The positive things, we'll talk about that. The positive things that youth ministry brings